Welcome you all to another session wherein we can learn the nitty-gritties of the civil appeals, their appreciation of evidence, that is oral and documentary. Those who have been involved professionally know very well that understanding as to how the evidence can be appreciated within the scope of civil appeal is an art to be learned within a flux of time, as well as what is the scope in an appeal in civil cases. Also is an art which one learns. And if we learn that art and what is the scope within the civil appeal and how that evidence has to be appreciated. To learn that nuances and what is the scope, we requested Honorable Mr. Justice A. Hari Prasad, a judge of Kerala High Court, to give the insights to a topic which not only the professionals would learn and get themselves enriched, but at the same time, the students of law, if they learn during the, as we say, in the nursery itself, that is the university is called the nursery for the learning of the professional academics. It's the best way forward, and they will be more confident to move forward in these spheres of civil law. As they otherwise say that civil law is quite complex, but if you learn the nitty-gritties, then it's always easy to understand that same. Honorable Mr. Justice A. Hari Prasad has always been associated with the Kerala Judicial Academy. And it was always a pleasure learning the nuances from a judge who has been closer to the Judicial Academy, because their insights while being given to the judicial officers is also to be learned about. And I've just seen that Justice N. Kumar has also joined, and he has said, good evening, Justice Hari Prasad. We have
good evening, sir.
National Judicial Academy. So we are we are unmuting Justice N. Kumar also. We had a webinar sir, yesterday with him, and it has been widely well received. Justice N. Kumar.
Okay.
And I thought the Facebook was looking upon that Justice N. Kumar should join us, and that is why we were trying to stream up with the Facebook. It wasn't going about you had torrential rains, but somehow in our Facebook was there. They were just waiting for Justice N. Kumar. So Justice N. Kumar, a few words from your side for Justice A. Hari Prasad, and we are all gaga about the way you gave the insights yesterday. Over to you, Justice N. Kumar.
He is not seen, Mr. Vikram. He is not seen.
So you have been unmuted, but Justice Kumar, we are not able to see you. Justice Kumar, your video and your audio is not on. So we will try, we can start, we will ask Justice Kumar to do that. Yes, sir.
Okay. Good evening, all dear friends. Now, considering the voluminous nature of these two topics that I am supposed to handle today evening, I'll have to rush through these matters, I'm sure. Then I'll have to condense it in such a way that maximum coverage of these justification for these subjects should be done. So in that way, I'll try my level best to confine to important aspects in civil appeals and also appreciation of both documentary and oral evidence. As everyone knows, because I'm targeting a junior group of junior lawyers, my target group in my mind is junior lawyers, junior officers, and not very senior persons, because for them it may be some sort of a repetition, but then still, I'll just start from the fundamentals. The word appeal has to mean that removal of a cause from an inferior to a superior court for the purpose of testing the soundness of the decision of the inferior court. So appeal is movement of cause from inferior court to superior court for the purpose of testing its soundness. That was first said in the year 1932, in a year 1932 Privy Council 165. Then, as all of us know, appeal, there is no vested right for an appeal. There is no constitutional right for an appeal, especially in the case of first appeal. We are talking about first appeal now. Second appeal, it is more difficult because you have to establish a substantial question of law. In a civil case, first appeal, even in the case of a first appeal, there is no vested right. There is no what you call natural right. There is no constitutional right. It is only a statutory right. If a particular statute provides a right of appeal, then only it can be taken to a higher forum. I think Mr. Vikas, I'm clear, audible? Mr. Vikas, hello, clear?
Yes, it's audible. It's audible.
Yes, okay. So, a litigant having a grievance of a civil nature, independently of any statute, has a right to file a suit. If you read section 9 CPC, we will see that there is a right to file a suit of a civil nature. That is a generally conferred right. But in the case of an appeal, such a right does not exist and cannot be assumed unless expressly given by statute or rules having the force of statute. Now that is, I think I need not give you some decisions on this point. These are all two fundamentals, right from year 1935 Privy Council, page 5. So you will find lot of catenary of decisions, and 74 Supreme Court 1126, year 1974 Supreme Court 1126 is the classic decision on the point. Then comes, when a statute provides a right of appeal, it is a substantive right. Once it is provided, it becomes a substantive right. Nobody can defeat it. Of course, subject to restrictions in the case of first appeal as provided in Order 41 Rule 11, right of admission hearing. That of course is there, but then there is a statutory vested right to file an appeal when it is provided as a right. Then you may refer to year 2015 Supreme Court 1042, Videocon International, year 2015 Supreme Court 1042. Then who can appeal? Probably the next question, who can appeal? As a general principle, no one can appeal from a decree unless he was a party to the lower court proceedings. That is a fundamental rule. Or a legal representative of one of the parties, or anybody privy to the estate of one of the parties. So he must be either a party or a legal representative or a privy to the estate of one of the parties. But a person who is not a party to the action may also be allowed, with the leave of the court, he can file an appeal, provided if he is adversely affected by the order, and the appellate court thinks that in such a case, he should be given a right of appeal, leave should be given. In that situation, a person who is not a party to the proceeding also can file an appeal. Please refer to year 1971 Supreme Court 374, year 71 Supreme Court 374, year 1974 Supreme Court 994, year 76 Supreme Court 2602. Many decisions. I just give a couple of decisions. So, in order to file an appeal, two things must be established. One, the subject matter of appeal must be a decree, that is conclusive determination of the rights of parties. So there must be a decree. Then comes the party appealing must have been adversely affected by the decree. These are the two conditions for conferring a right of appeal on a person. Now suppose in a suit, the party claims two alternate reliefs. Instead of, in a case, assume recovery of possession on the strength of title, along with a prohibitory injunction. Both are claimed as an alternative relief. And if he is given one of the reliefs, he can't file an appeal complaining that both should have been granted. That is commonsensical. Then, there was a controversy regarding whether an appeal can be maintained against a finding. If you read section 96 CPC, it will be clear that a first appeal can be filed only against a decree. But certain findings, though if left unchallenged, will have the effect of it will have the effect of causing difficulties at a later point in time, or it may operate as res judicata in a subsequent proceedings. Considering that aspect, the Honorable Supreme Court in Ramadhar Srivas, 2005, 13 SCC, page 1. That's a 3-judge bench decision. 2005, 13 SCC, page 1. It has been held that an aggrieved party can file an appeal against an adverse finding, though ultimately he succeeded in the proceedings. Then, suppose a suit is decreed or dismissed, and ultimately it is found that there is no jurisdiction for the trial court. Even then, since it is a decree passed by a court, it can be challenged in an appeal. These are all some fundamental points I'm just telling before going to the nitty-gritties of Order 41. Then coming to appeal against a dead person, we all know that appeal filed against a dead person is a stillborn appeal, and a decree passed in such an appeal is a nullity. Then another category of appeals possible is, appeals not permissible are appeals filed against consent decrees. If you read section 96(3) CPC, subsection 3 of section 96, it will be clear that no appeal is provided against a consent decree, because the parties have agreed to pass a decree in terms of their conditions or their agreement. Then one decision, a 3-judge bench decision of the Supreme Court, 2005, 6 SEC 300. 2005, volume 6 SEC 300 equal to AR 2005 Supreme Court 3799. There it is held. 96(3) and Order 23 Rule 3 Proviso and Order 43 Rule 1M are relevant provisions. When there is a dispute whether there was a compromise or not, a decree accepting the compromise on resolution of that controversy could not be said to be a decree passed with the consent of the parties. Hence, the bar under 96(3) could not have an application. That is the only exception provided. Blanket bar provided under 96(3) is taken out only when the decree accepting the compromise on resolution of that controversy could not be said to be a decree passed with the consent of the parties. If there is no element of consent in the decree, then it can be challenged in an appeal. That is what the 3-judge bench in year 2005 Supreme Court 3799 says. Another decision also, 2006 5 SCC 566 equal to AER 2006 Supreme Court 2628. There, Lordship Justice R.V. Ravindran has laid down the principles regarding a maintainability of an appeal against a decree passed on consent. Then regarding, suppose two suits are jointly tried, common evidence, two suits jointly tried and a decree passed after the trial of two suits. Suppose one appeal is filed. Assume A filed a suit against B and B filed a cross suit against A in respect of the same subject matter. A suit was decreed and B suit was dismissed, and B files appeal against dismissal of his suit alone. He does not challenge the decree of A suit. Assume a situation, because it arises out of joint trial of two suits and two decrees virtually goes against B, but he challenges only the decree against dismissal of his suit. In that event, the appeal filed by B in respect of a decree passed in his suit will be barred by res judicata, because he is bound to challenge both the decrees. That's a fundamental decision on this point is AER 1962 Supreme Court 338. 1993, that's a Kerala decision. You will find it. It's a Kerala case, Premier Tires versus KSRTC, Kerala State Road Transport Corporation. I have only that Kerala citation here. That is 1993 to KLT, Kerala Law Times 130. It's a Supreme Court decision. And 1966 Supreme Court 1332 is also there. So the principle is that if two suits jointly tried are decrees passed therein are not challenged, one of the decree may operate as res judicata against the other, and the appeal filed against one decree shall not be heard and decided by virtue of by the operation of section 11 CPC. That is the principle. So res judicata also may come in at certain point. Then comes doctrine of merger. That we know the principle, because the principle of merger is very simple. There cannot be two operative decrees at a given point in time. That is the principle behind doctrine of merger. Only one decree in respect of one suit between the parties can have operation, and two decrees cannot operate at a time in respect of the same cause. So when a matter is taken to an appellate court and the appeal is either allowed or the decree is confirmed or modified, whatever it is, the appellate court handles this, and the decree passed by the court below will get submerged in the appellate decree. The decree passed by the appellate court is a decree in the suit, and the appellate judgment stands in the place of the original judgment for all legal purposes. In other words, the decree of the lower court merges in the decree of the superior court. First said in AIR 1954 Supreme Court 1380. AIR 1954 Supreme Court 1380. You may please refer to AIR 87 Supreme Court 1304. 1966 Supreme Court 1332 is also there, describing the principles of merger. Then you may please refer to AIR 2004 Supreme Court 1596 also, where the principle of merger has been discussed in detail. So the effect of merger is that there will be only one decree in operation at a given point in time in respect of a cause between two parties, and the executable decree is the decree that is passed by the appellate court. Then Section 97 CPC says if no appeal is preferred against a preliminary decree, if there are two decrees in a case, like in the case of mortgage, we have two decrees. In the case of a partition suit, there are two decrees. Even in the case of in a suit for accounting, probably there can be two decrees possible. So if there is no challenge against a preliminary decree which declares the rights of the parties, questions involved in preliminary decree cannot be agitated in a final decree appeal. That is what Section 97 says. Then the principle of 99 is no decree to be reversed or modified for error or irregularity not affecting merits or jurisdiction. So minor errors or simple mistakes, irregularities cannot be a ground for challenge so long as it doesn't affect the merit or jurisdiction of the in the case. That is 99. Then regarding powers of appellate court, you may please refer to Section 107 CPC, which says that appellate court is having all the powers of the original court. That is what the section says. The subject to such conditions and limitations as may be prescribed. An appellate court shall have power A, to determine a case finally. It's a final adjudication possible in an appeal. B, to remand a case if there is some defect in the decision or which requires additional evidence or some other purpose. We will see Order 41 Rule 23 later. It can be remanded. Then C, to frame issues and refer them for trial. That is called issue remand. Then D, to take additional evidence or to require such evidence to be taken for the proper adjudication of the appeal. So these are the general powers vested in an appellate court. Subsection 2 to Section 107 clearly says, subject as aforesaid, the appellate court shall have the same powers and shall perform as nearly as may be the same duties as are conferred and imposed by this court on courts of original jurisdiction in respect of suits instituted therein. So the power of appellate court is coextensive and coterminous with that of the original court. That is the basic principle. In addition to that, the appellate court has a power to determine the case finally, looking into the evidence and looking into the questions of law, and then remand a case to make a issue remand and ask the court below to take evidence and send the records back, or to take additional evidence either by the appellate court or by the lower court. So these are additional powers these are powers in addition to the powers vested in an original court. So that is what 107 says. Then I'll deal with appreciation of evidence after completing this, making some mention about the other provisions in Order 41, probably which are relevant for our discussion on the topic of civil appeals. I'll skip this very procedural provisions. I'll just skip for paucity of time. Rule 1 deals about form of appeal, which we may not go into much. Then Rule 2, grounds which may be taken in appeal. All legal and factual grounds can be taken in appeal. Then Rule 3 says the appeal memorandum can be rejected. Assume court fee has not been paid despite giving an opportunity. Court fee has not been paid, requisite court fee not paid, then the appeal memorandum can be rejected, but the rejection should be the entire appeal memorandum, not part of it. Then Rule 3A deals with this belated appeals, where a petition under Section 5 of the Limitation Act for continuation of delay is expected. If an appeal is filed out of time, prescribed time, normally here it is 30 days, and of course it varies from state to state. Our rule says 30 days, first appeal. If not 30 days, if an appeal is not filed in 30 days, you have to file it with an application under Section 5. The Supreme Court says that it is not mandatory. The application for condonation of delay need not be filed along with the appeal. It can be filed even on a subsequent date, explaining the delay, that's all. Merely for the reason that a belated appeal was filed without an application, it cannot be summarily rejected. That is what the Supreme Court says in 2000 volume 7 SCC 372. So a belated appeal should be accompanied by a petition for condonation of delay, but it need not be filed along with it. Ideally, it should be filed along with the appeal. But in case if it is omitted to be filed, it can be filed on a subsequent date with reasonable explanation for the delay. Then, if an application under Section 5 is filed, the code says the appeal can be regarded as a proposed appeal. It is not a regular appeal, or it does not come with its full vigor. So what we have to do is we have to issue notice to the respondent, and he should be heard on the question of delay before taking any decision on the appeal. Then Rule 5 deals with the stay by the appellate court. The conditions, if you read that provision, it will be clear that there must be sufficient cause shown for obtaining an order of stay against the operation of the lower court decree, and it should also be established that substantial loss would be suffered by the appellant unless the operation of the decree is stayed. And in the case of a money decree, it is specifically provided in the provision that the court is obliged to direct the appellant, who may be the defendant if he is the defendant in a money suit decreed against him, he is obliged to give security for the decree that is likely to be confirmed against him in the appeal, so that the successful party shall not be put to prejudice if security is not furnished probably by the time when the appeal is disposed of after 2 years or 3 years. Suppose the defendant becomes impecunious, then he will not be able to realize the fruits of the decree. To avoid that, security should be insisted in the case of a money decree. And Order 27 Rule 8 capital A. Order 27 Rule 8 capital A says that there cannot be a direction issued against a government to furnish security, because you are not supposed to think that the government will go in liquidation or will become pauper at a later point of time. So in the case where the defendant is government and the decree is in terms of money, even then the government is not bound to deposit money or give security. That is Order 27 Rule 8A. Then effective stay order is from the date of communication. And there was a decision in AR 67 Supreme Court saying that order of stay of execution operates only from the time it is communicated to the executing court, and hence a sale held before such communication is not invalid. That is what the Supreme Court in AR 67 Supreme Court 1386 held. To circumvent the difficulty, because there may be delay in communication, suppose the appellate court situated about 100 kilometers away passes an order of stay, and before reaching the order of stay to the court concerned, suppose the decree is put to execution, the appellant will be put to prejudice. So now it is stated in the provision that the appellant can file an affidavit stating that the appellate court has passed a stay order. We need not wait for the actual communication of the order. That is what the effect of amendment on account of this decision that was effected in 1976. Then Rule 9 deals with procedure on admission. Then Rule 11, probably one provision relevant for our purpose, is the power of the appellate court to dismiss an appeal in limine if it finds that there is no merit in the appeal. Of course, normally the normal rule is that a first appeal shall not be dismissed at the threshold because you are examining the correctness of a decree passed by the lower court, and that is the last opportunity for him to agitate on facts. Because in second appeal, substantial question of law alone will be considered. So it is normally not advisable to dismiss an appeal at the first hearing itself, fine under Rule 11. But the court has power in an appropriate case. Assume a suit based on a promissory note, demand promissory note, filed after 4 years. Let us take one example. It is filed after 4 years. Ex facie, on the face of it, it is a time-barred suit. The court below dismisses the suit merely on the question of limitation. When an appeal is filed, the appellate court also finds that this is much beyond the time prescribed for by the law of limitation. Then, of course, probably the Rule 11 power can be invoked in such a suit. Hello.
So, may I make a request? People are requesting that probably they are finding you are slightly faster because they are writing down the notes.
Okay.
Yeah, because a lot of people have written that we shouldn't go with the pace. Whatever we do, let's do which everyone can understand.
Okay. If I am fast, please tell me so that I was in a hurry to cover all the topics. That's
no, it's fine.
I'll reduce my speed now.
Yeah, we can reduce the citations, but we can understand the subject.
Okay, so then I need not give you the citation because I thought juniors would be
1122 citation is good enough because that way the people will also be able to write, and we will ask you to share those judgments. We will share it in the WhatsApp group.
Okay,
that would be fine.
Okay. 1 minute, Mr. Vikas. Is there any clarification in respect to the matters so far I covered?
No, it's fine. It's only that people are writing that ask to slightly speak slow. They are not able to jot down the judgments. But we will tell the participants that we will share all those judgments on the WhatsApp groups itself.
Okay. Anyway, I'll be a bit slow so that let them also follow with me.
Yes.
Okay. Then Rule 11, I told you, as told you earlier, Rule 11 only gives a power to the first appellate court to dismiss an appeal without sending notice to lower court. But that power should be very sparingly exercised because of the fact that the first appeal, in a first appeal, that is the last opportunity for a litigant to have a reappraisal of facts. And when an appeal is dismissed under Order 41 Rule 11, before sending notice to the respondent, if it is dismissed by a court inferior to High Court, a decree shall be drafted. A short judgment shall be written stating the reason why it is dismissed, and a decree shall be drafted. That is what the provision says. Then, an appeal shall not be usually dismissed summarily. You will find a decision in AER 1973 Supreme Court 218. AER 73 Supreme Court 218. Of course, that is before amendment. There is no change in the legal principle. Then another principle is that an appeal can be dismissed under Order 41 Rule 11(1) merits without hearing the appellant or his pleader if he does not appear or argue on a date fixed for hearing. Once the opportunity of being heard at the stage of admission of appeal is given to the appellant, and the appellant or his pleader does not appear, and the appellate court can either proceed to dismiss the appeal on merits under Subrule 1 of Rule 11 or dismiss the appeal for default under Subrule 2. So once the court gives an opportunity to the counsel for the appellant to argue the appeal on merit,
And if it is for some reason adjourned, if it doesn't turn up, the appellate court can dismiss the appeal on merits, or it can dismiss for default at the discretion of the court. Then you have to bear in mind one fact, that once an appeal is dismissed on merits under Order 41 11 1, subclause 1, readmission of appeal is not possible. So it should be very, very sparingly done. It's not a matter of course. One decision relevant is AER 2002 Supreme Court 1447. 2002 Supreme Court 1447. Yes, right. Then we will skip other provisions. Then right to begin an appeal is vested with the appellant. That is what Rule 16 says. Then Rule 17, Order 41 Rule 17 deals with dismissal of appeal for appellant's default. Suppose the appeal is heard under Order 41 Rule 11 and it is admitted to file. And when it is taken up for hearing, final hearing, if the appellant is absent or his counsel is absent without any justification, then the court has a power to dismiss the appeal for default under Rule 17. It is definitely clear, there cannot be a doubt that the appellate court has no power to dismiss the appeal on merits. It can only dismiss the appeal for default. Because without hearing the appellant, it cannot be dismissed touching upon its merits. Then comes Rule 19. Rule 19 speaks about readmission of appeal dismissed under Rule 17. Readmission of appeal dismissed for default under Rule 17. Appeals dismissed under Rule 11.2, because 11.2 also gives, Rule 11.2 also provides dismissal for default. If it is adjourned to other day, if a counsel is absent, the court has a right to dismiss it for default under Rule 11.2. Likewise, Rule 17 also provides such a right for the court. In those situations, it may be readmitted under Rule 19 on the application of the appellant. He must establish that he was prevented by sufficient cause from appearing on the date fixed for hearing of the appeal. Suppose that application is filed beyond time. Your Kerala rules prescribes 30 days for the application for restoration of appeal. Maybe there may be different state rules providing different time. I do not know. But if it is not filed within that time, you have to file an application under Section 5 also to explain the delay. Then another remedy available to the appellant when an appeal is dismissed for default is that he may file a fresh appeal provided the law of limitation permits. If it is barred by limitation, he can't. I mean, if it is beyond limitation, he can't do it. In case the law of limitation if permits, he can file another appeal. Then comes then what is important is Rule 21. Rule 21 is when an appeal is decided ex parte only on hearing the appellant or without hearing the respondent. If an appeal is decided, the respondent's right, he being aggrieved by the ex parte decree, his right is to file an application under Rule 21 to rehear the appeal on merits. That arises only in a case where the appeal is heard ex parte and the appellant alone is heard and decided against the respondent. In that event, the respondent under Rule 21 can make an application to rehear the appeal. He can show two reasons for that. One, notice was not duly served on him. He abstained from court because there was no proper service of notice on him. One reason. Or he was prevented by sufficient cause from appearing when the appeal was called on for hearing. So these are the two grounds on which he can file an application under Rule 21 for rehearing an appeal. If there is any delay in filing such an application, he can take resort to Section 5 of the Limitation Act also. Then another important provision is Rule 22, that is regarding the right to file cross objection. So I shall briefly state the principles in Rod 41 Rule 22, cross objection. Normally, the respondent, the successful party in the court below, the original court, can support the decree to the extent it is in his favor. He can also state that a finding on an issue, though ultimately he succeeded, the finding on an issue should have been in his favor. That finding may not have any effect in the decree, in the what you call the relief granted, but still he can complain that finding should have been in his favor. So the appellant the respondent has a right to support the decree as well as make a complaint against certain findings which went against him, though ultimately he succeeded in the trial court. Then he may also file a cross objection to the decree, which he could have taken by way of an appeal, provided he files such objection in the appellate court within 1 month from the date of service of notice on him or reader, or within such further time as the appellate court may allow. CPC provides 30 days for filing a cross objection from the date of reception of notice. So the principle behind this provision is that the respondent, if he has assumed a respondent who has completely succeeded, or he got a decree, the suit was completely dismissed, he has no grievance against the decree, and he can simply support the decree. If the plaintiff files an appeal, defendant can simply suppose there are 5 reliefs claimed in a suit against the defendant. 4 have been dismissed, 1 allowed in favor of the plaintiff. 5 reliefs claimed by plaintiff, 4 went against him, 1 relief granted against the respondent defendant. But the respondent defendant is not interested in challenging it. He takes a view, after all, out of 5, plaintiff lost 4. Why should I go in appeal? If he wants, let him take up the matter in appeal. If that is his attitude, he is perfectly okay. He can simply sit without filing an appeal against the 5th finding which has gone against him. But in case the plaintiff files an appeal against the rejected 4 reliefs, he gets a further opportunity to change his mind, to file a cross objection, challenging that part of the decree which had gone against him. So that is the principle behind this 4122. A person who is happy with the minor setback that he has suffered in a suit can keep quiet. But if the plaintiff again pursues with appeal, he gets a second chance. Even if he has taken a decision not to fight by filing an appeal, he gets a second chance under Order 41 Rule 22 to agitate the decree by filing, challenge the decree by filing a cross objection under Order 41 Rule 22. So that is the spirit of this provision. And one more important aspect is that a cross objection becomes mandatory in a case where cross objection becomes mandatory in a case where a portion of the decree has gone against the respondent. If it is a finding, he need not file a cross objection. But if it is a portion of the decree that has gone against the respondent, he is bound to file a cross objection because he has to challenge the decree, any portion of it, even if it is a small portion. He has to challenge it by a cross objection. In respect of a finding, he may or may not file a cross objection. That is the difference. There is one classic decision on the point. I request everyone to read that decision. Well said, a year 1999 Supreme Court 1747. A year 1999 Supreme Court 1747. I'll just read out a passage from that decision. So that will make the position very clear. Appeal is a substantive right, of course, once it is provided. It is a creation of the statute. Right to appeal does not exist unless it is specifically conferred. cross objection is like an appeal. It has all the trappings of an appeal. It is filed in the form of memorandum and provision of Order 41 CPC, so far as these relate to the form and contents of memorandum, apply to cross objection as well. Court fee is payable on cross objection like that on appeal. Provisions relating to appeals by indigent person also apply to cross objections. Even where the appeal is withdrawn or dismissed for default, cross objection may nevertheless be heard and determined. Respondent, even though has not appealed, may support the decree on any other ground, but if wants to modify it, he has to file cross objection to the decree, which objections he could have taken earlier by filing an appeal. So if he wants to get the decree modified in his favor, he has to file a cross objection. If there is a finding, he may or may not file a finding adverse to him, he may or may not file a cross objection. Then time for filing objection, which is in the nature of appeal, is extended by 1 month after service of notice on him of the day fixed for hearing the appeal. This time could also be extended by the court. Cross objection is nothing but an appeal, a cross appeal at that. It may be that the respondent wanted to give a quietus to the whole litigation by his accepting the judgment and decree or order, even if it was partly against his interest. However, when the other party challenged the same by filing an appeal, statute gave the respondent a second chance to file an appeal by way of cross objection if he still felt aggrieved by the judgment or order. That is, it's lucidly said in 1999 Supreme Court 1747. So that is the principle in Order 41 Rule 22 regarding filing of cross objections. Then I'll skip to 23, Rule 23, which says remand. The CPC provides 3 types of remands. One is in Rule 23, the other one in Rule 23 capital A, and the third one in Rule 25. So remand contemplated under Rule 23 is when a decree is passed by the trial court on a preliminary point or preliminary issue. The provision clearly says where the court from whose a decree and appeal is preferred has disposed of the suit upon a preliminary point, the decree is reversed in appeal. Then the appellate court may, if it thinks fit, order the remand case, direct the court below to try all the issues, etc. So that is 23 comes into play when the remand is in respect of a decree which is passed or disposed on a preliminary point. Then comes 23A, where the court from whose decree an appeal is preferred has disposed of the case otherwise than on a preliminary point. That comes after trial, after consideration of all the issues arising in the case. So 23A is a larger thing. And the decree is reversed in appeal and retrial is considered necessary, the appellate court shall have the same power as under 23. So when 23 remand is exercised, the appellate court finds that the disposal of the suit on a preliminary point was incorrect, because the trial court must not have handled other issues arising in the case. For example, law of limitation or bar of suit by some statute. This must have been the reason for disposal of the suit. Suppose that is reversed by the appellate court. If it is confirmed, there is no question of remand. If it is reversed, then the appellate court should set aside the finding and answer that finding in favor of the party filing appeal and direct the court below to consider all the other issues after taking evidence. 23A situation comes when the trial court has taken evidence and disposed case in a particular manner. The appellate court finds that there was no proper trial in respect of certain matters directly arising in the case. In that event, it can be remanded by invoking power under Order 23, Rule 3A. Then comes 25. 25 says, where the court from whose decree the appeal is preferred has omitted to frame or try any issue or to determine any question of fact which appears to the appellate court essential to the right decision of the suit upon merits, the appellate court may, if necessary, frame issues and refer the same for trial court from whose decree the appeal is preferred, and in such case shall direct such court to take the additional evidence required. And such court shall proceed to try such issues and shall return the evidence to the appellate court together with its findings thereon, and the reasons therefore within such time as may be fixed by the appellate court or extended by it from time to time. So this is a type of remand where the appellate court, suppose a suit is fully disposed on merits, an appeal is taken to appellate court. The appellate court finds that a proper issue was not raised, a issue arising out of pleadings was not raised, or it was raised but it was defective in form, or any question of fact was not properly considered, then the appellate court may frame an additional issue and send that issue alone to the trial court, directing the trial court to record evidence on that issue and directing the trial court to enter a finding on that issue and then that answer back to the appellate court. So that this is a type of remand where it is a restricted remand, where the appellate court retains the appeal and directs the court below to frame, take evidence and answer a particular issue and then send back the finding to the appellate court, so that this will form part of the appeal already pending, and correctness of that also will be examined along with other matters pending in the appeal. So this is a case, 25 deals with a case where the appeal is retained by the appellate court and one issue is relegated back to the trial court for decision and then asking for its finding on that issue. So there are three types of remand. 23 deals with when a suit is disposed on a preliminary point, 23A when the entire suit is disposed on answering all issues, and 25 says when there is no proper framing of issues or when facts are not properly considered. These are the three types of remand contemplated under Order 41. Now, pertaining to all these provisions, there are certain rules regarding the exercise of power of remand by the appellate court. It shall not be exercised for mere asking. That is the fundamental rule. Power of remand shall be exercised very sparingly. To the extent, because the philosophy of CPC is clear from Rule 24. It says, where the evidence upon the record is sufficient to enable the appellate court to pronounce judgment, the appellate court may, after resettling the issues if necessary, finally determine the suit, notwithstanding that the judgment of the court from whose decree the appeal is preferred has proceeded wholly upon some ground other than that on which the appellate court proceeds. So the normal rule is that if there are sufficient evidence available in the records, remand is not permitted, because remand always will have the tendency to prolong the litigation. That will be a prolonged misery for the litigants. It will give an undue lease of life to the litigation. So remand to the extent possible should be avoided. So remand cannot be done as a matter of course. Three types of remand should be very sparingly done. And there is one constitution bench decision which says that remand can be resorted to only when there was no trial on a particular issue. That was before 1976. That was prior to 1976. So maybe there is a change. 23A was added in 1976. So this was prior to that. But still the principle that remand shall not be made as a matter of course still is the point accepted by all courts, including the apex court. Then it is a matter of discretion for the appellate court. Discretion means it is not an arbitrary discretion. It is a sound judicial discretion. It should be exercised sparingly. Please refer to AER 1988 Supreme Court 2123. AER 1988 Supreme Court 2123. Also see AER 1976 Supreme Court 866. In addition to these provisions, probably the court can make a remand under exception circumstances, compelling circumstances, like when the appellate court directs amendment of plaint. Suppose a suit for injunction, prohibitory injunction, permanent prohibitory injunction was filed, asserting that the plaintiff is in possession of the property. He lost in the first court. He comes up in appeal before the appellate court. And later he realizes or admits that the plaintiff lost possession or he is not in possession of the property. And all of us know that in a suit for injunction, what is to be established is that the plaintiff is in possession of the suit property as on the date of suit. Suppose the plaintiff feels that he will not be able to establish that he was in possession on the date of suit. If he has title to the property, he can make an amendment and seek an amendment to make the suit one for recovery of possession on the strength of title. Suppose such an amendment is made, necessarily this amendment is made in the appellate court. Then necessarily this has to go to the trial court because evidence will have to be let in. So that is one situation, probably not covered by this thing because it's a general power to remand. Then lot of other situations possible, like that comes. And section 105 CPC clearly says, section 105 subsection 2 clearly says that if a party aggrieved by an order of remand from which an appeal lies does not appeal therefrom, he cannot subsequently question the correctness of the order of remand even under the inherent power of the court. That is what the Supreme Court in AR 70, Supreme Court 997 says. AR 70, Supreme Court 997. By virtue of section 105 subsection 2, if an order of remand is not challenged by the party who is not accepting the order of remand, then if it is not challenged in appeal, he has to face the trial before the remanded court. Later, he cannot complain about the order of remand. So these are the provisions relating to remand. Then comes additional evidence. That is also important in the case of exercise of appellate power. Rule 27, Order 41, Rule 27 deals with production of additional evidence. The fundamental rule is that additional evidence shall not be normally let in an appeal because the reason is very simple. It is continuation of a suit. So whatever evidence produced before the court will have to be considered by the appellate court to find out whether the decision taken by the original court is correct or not. So additional evidence is very sparingly allowed. It is not the normal rule. Then I'll give you one classic decision on the point. The general principle is that the appellate court should not travel outside the record of the lower court and cannot take any evidence in appeal. That is the basic principle. But of course, subject to 27. AER 1965 Supreme Court 1008. AER 1965 Supreme Court 1008. Then, if you read Order 41 Rule 27, there are certain conditions for allowing a party to adduce additional evidence in an appeal. Let us see what are they. 1. The trial court must have refused to admit evidence which ought to have been admitted. There is an improper refusal to admit an evidence which should have been admitted at the trial stage. One condition. 2. Notwithstanding the exercise of due diligence, such evidence was not within the knowledge of the party seeking production of additional evidence. Despite best diligence and exercise of his prudence, the appellant or party producing additional evidence was not able to find out the existence of such an evidence, and therefore he wants it to be admitted in appeal. That is the second situation. And third one, the appellate court requires any document to be produced or any witness to be examined to enable it to pronounce a judgment. For effective disposal of the appeal, if the appellate court itself finds that some documents are to be produced or witness to be examined, then the appellate court can direct the party to adduce additional evidence. So, if you read this 41 Rule 27, you will find that the refusal to admit evidence and despite the exercise of due diligence, it could not be found out, are matters to be established by the party producing additional evidence. It is his burden. But in the case of when the appellate court requires additional evidence, he need not prove anything. Then it is the requirement of the court. The other two circumstances, he has to prove it. And there is a residuary clause also which says for any other substantial cause, the appellate court can permit an additional evidence to be produced. So regarding additional evidence, the principle is very clear. Normal rule, no additional evidence, but under certain circumstances, party can show reason for not producing the evidence before the original court, or if the appellate court wants it, it can direct the party to produce evidence. Then I'll just give some citations. AER 1951 Supreme Court 51 Supreme Court 193. AER 51 Supreme Court 193. AER 1963 Supreme Court 1526. AER 63 Supreme Court 1526. AER 1997 Supreme Court. AER 1997 Supreme Court 3243. 3243. Then when the appellate court finds itself unable to pronounce judgment owing to lacuna or defect in the evidence as it stands, it may admit additional evidence. That is AER 79, Supreme Court 553. AER 1979, Supreme Court 553. Then there are some decisions of the Supreme Court which say, in exceptional cases, court will depart from the general rule, especially whereby so doing, it can shorten the litigation and best attain the ends of justice. Because this is a discretionary power, discretion has to be exercised judiciously, and the Supreme Court says that for shortening the litigation and attaining best ends of justice, additional evidence can be admitted. Please refer to AER 1957, Supreme Court 875. That is exceptional cases only. 57 Supreme Court 875. AER 85 Supreme Court 371. 85 Supreme Court 371. AER 81 Supreme Court 1113. That is 1113. 81 Supreme Court 1113. Then recent decision on the point 2012 8 SEC 148. 2012 8 SEC 148. 2011 AER 2011 Supreme Court 559. These are all pertaining to this point. Then coming to Order 41 Rule 33, I'll just make a fast. I will make a mention about that also. Order 41 Rule 33 is said to be a reservoir of power for appellate court. That is very important because the principle in Order 41 Rule 33 says that the appellate court is bound to pass a decree which is not only correct, which ought to have been passed by the trial court. That is the word used in Order 41 Rule 33. It shows that it becomes the bounden duty of the appellate court to pass not only a correct decree, but a fair decree which ought to have been passed at the first instance. That is what the provision says. The object of this rule is to enable the appellate court to do complete justice between the parties and to avoid contradictory and inconsistent decisions on the same question in the same suit. Then, the appellate court shall have power to pass any decree and make any order which ought to have been passed, and to pass or make such further order or decree or order as the case may require. Then, this power may be exercised by the court, notwithstanding that the appeal is as to part only of the decree. Because that situation may arise in a suit for partition. Suppose there is a mistake in one part. The other part, the party who suffers the mistake has not challenged the decree. Take a situation. So if appellate court finds that unless you tinker with the mistaken part, if you are not able to give an effective decree to all parties, because in a partition suit, all parties are presumed to be plaintiffs, because all parties are sharers. So if you tinker with one portion, if there is a disturbance in the other portion, even in respect of non-appealing portion, probably the appellate court will have to pass a correct decree. That is the principle in Order 41 Rule 33. And that doesn't happen in all cases, depending on the nature of the litigation that is taken in appeal. It further says, Rule 33 further says, it may be exercised in favor of all or any of the respondents or parties, although such respondents or parties may not have filed any appeal or objection. Even without an appeal, the respondent can be given reliefs, provided the decree is in such a nature, inseparable decrees, not an injunction decree or a money decree. There can be recovery of possession decrees or partition decrees, where there is one unit, one composite unit. Depends on the nature of suit. So these are the principles. You may please refer to AER 1963 Supreme Court 1901, AER 1963 Supreme Court 1901, AER 1988 Supreme Court 54, 88 Supreme Court 54, AER 65 Supreme Court 1874, 65 Supreme Court 1874. Then 1994 2 SEC 41, 1994 Volume 2 SEC 41. That is that's a good decision on the point. And you may please also refer to 98 Supreme Court, AER 1998 Supreme Court, 3118. So these are the points relating to appeals. I'll just conclude this, the appeals. So powers and duties of appellate court we have now seen. Then coming to appreciation of evidence in appeals. Actually, the right or obligation or duty, the power and duty cast upon the appellate court to appreciate the decree is also similar to that of the original court. There is no distinction. Insofar as oral evidence is concerned, the appellate court has to reconcile the conflicting viewpoints, because we have to consider one aspect. We have to consider one aspect because we have to consider one important aspect, that the trial court had the opportunity to see the demeanor of the witness. They have to see the witness in flesh and blood. So suppose the trial court draws an inference from the at the time when it recorded the evidence, that has to be given some weightage. That is also covered by decisions 51 AER 51 Supreme Court 120, 51 Supreme Court 120, 60 Supreme Court 115, AER 60 Supreme Court 115. Because the trial court had the added advantage of seeing the witnesses in action. The appellate court sees the records only. So when there is an appreciation of oral evidence, probably this factor will have to be borne in mind by the appellate court. On the same point, one more decision, 80 Supreme Court 2026. 80 Supreme Court 2026. Then, regarding the appreciation of documentary evidence, we have to consider the principles relating to appreciation of evidence, because we are all aware that Section 3 of the Evidence Act defines prove, not prove, and disprove. I'm not going into the rudimentary aspects of it. Then comes the provisions in the Evidence Act pertaining to civil suits. Specifically, I'll just mention some provisions. In Chapter 2, dealing with relevancy of facts, you will find sections 17 to 23 dealing with admissions. So admissions are generally applicable in civil cases only, because in a criminal case, admissions are, we call it as confessions. So admissions provided in section 17 to 23 may also arise for interpretation, or rather the assessment of evaluation of the qualitative, the value of the evidence. So we have to bear in mind the principles in section 17 to 23. Whether, everyone knows the fundamental principle that an admission can be explained always. Admission is the best piece binding on a party unless it is explained. Suppose the party explains an admission saying that, yes, I have admitted it in a particular manner, but on such and such reasons, the court can see that the admission was erroneous. Suppose a person mistakes a cow for an ox. He admits that it's a cow. I'm just telling you one example. Cow is mistakenly admitted to be an ox, or vice versa. Then it can be explained, or it can be corrected. So admissions, unless explained, it is binding on the parties. We will find Order 12 also. So decreeing on admissions is provided in Order 12 CPC. So that is admissions applicable to civil cases are dealt with in section 17 to 23 of the Indian Evidence Act. Then comes relevancy of previous judgments. Those are also relevant here. Sections 40 to 44 of the Evidence Act deals with the relevancy of previous judgments. Of course, I will not be able to explaining those aspects. I'll just rush through that, and I want to finish, touch upon some other aspects. Then comes opinion evidence. For example, handwriting opinion or some other expert evidence falling in, between section 45 and 51 in the Evidence Act. Then character when relevant. Section 52 and 55 of Indian Evidence Act says that in civil cases, character generally not relevant, because in criminal cases, it assumes relevance. Character of a witness or an accused may be because in the case of an accused, probably higher punishment will be provided, habitual offender or something like that. In the case of a witness, if his character is bad, he can be impeached. His character can be impeached when we trial. General principle is that under section 52 and 55 of the Indian Evidence Act, in civil cases, character of a party is generally not relevant unless it appears in the context in a case, it becomes relevant. For example, in a suit for compensation for malicious prosecution, character may be relevant. Why? Because the plaintiff was maliciously prosecuted by the defendant is the question. So in that situation, probably the character assumes important. Otherwise, in a partition suit or in a recovery of possession suit, so recovery of possession on the strength of title, there is no relevancy of character. So in such matters, the oral evidence takes always a backseat and documentary evidence has a primacy in civil cases. Then comes oral evidence. Section 59 says all facts can be proved except the contents of a document or electronic records through oral evidence. All facts can be generally proved through oral evidence except contents of a document or electronic records. Section 60 says that the oral evidence must be direct. It can't be hearsay. It should be direct. Suppose a witness comes forward to prove possession of a property. Plaintiff says that I am in possession of the property in a suit for injunction. He examines a witness to prove plaintiff's possession, saying that he used to take income from the property. I have seen him residing in the house. So these are all incidents of possession, or rather instances where one party can assert that he is in possession of the property. Suppose such a witness is examined, he should be directly knowing it. He can't simply say that somebody told me that he is in possession. So that is not admissible. Then section 61, contents of document, how it is to be proved. You have to produce the document for proof of it. 62, primary evidence. 63, secondary evidence. Then 64, documents must be proved by primary evidence except as mentioned in section 65. 65 deals with proof of secondary evidence. Then 68 deals with proof of documents which are compulsorily attestable in the case of gift and will and some sort of bonds. At examination of one witness in the case of a disputed gift or other documents, in the case of a will, whether it is disputed or not, you have to examine a witness. That is what the Supreme Court says. Then comes 69 and other thing. Burden of proof, I'll just make a mention of it. 101 to 114A of Evidence Act deals with burden of proof. A party who may lose his case if evidence is not adduced is said burden of proof. Then comes estoppel, applicable to civil cases, dealt with in section 115 to 117. Then general provisions relating to witnesses contained in section 118 to 134. 118 speaks about the capacity of a witness, competency of a person to testify as a witness, and 134 says it is not the number of witnesses that matters, it is the quality of evidence that matters. That is the provision relating to this. Now, coming to this interpretation of documents and rule, suppose, as I told you, the civil cases are to be decided on the preponderance of probabilities. That is why, because in all civil cases, normally there will be two versions. One version put forward by the plaintiff and the other by the defendant. Which one is probable is the question to be decided. Whereas in a criminal case, there is only one version. The prosecution says that the accused has committed the crime. There is a traditional burden cast on the prosecution to establish guilt of the accused. Whereas in the civil case, it is different. So preponderance of probabilities is the main thing that guides the court to take a decision. I'll just give a classic decision on this point. AER 75 Supreme Court 1534. Dr. Dastane versus Mrs. S. Dastane. AER 1975 Supreme Court 1534. Paragraph 24. Normal rule which governs the civil proceedings is that the fact can be said to be established if it is proved by preponderance of probabilities. This is for the reason that under the Evidence Act Section 3, a fact is said to be proved when the court either believes it to exist or considers its existence so probable that a prudent man ought, under the circumstance of the particular case, to act upon the supposition that it exists. In belief regarding the existence of a fact may thus be founded on the balance of probabilities. So, going by Section 3, if you believe the existence of a fact, so you have to have two sets of facts, and you just evaluate these two sets of facts and find which version is more probable. That is the fundamental principle in deciding a civil suit or an appeal. Then, in this context, I might just give one more decision, that is 2001. A year 2002, sorry, a year 2003 Supreme Court 4548. A year 2003 Supreme Court 4548. That is relevant paragraphs are paragraphs 28, 29, 30. Same principles, and that deals with the appreciation of evidence in a civil case. 28, 29, 30. Yes, paragraphs. Then comes 79. A year 79 Supreme Court 2609. A year 79 Supreme Court 2609. That is dealing with interpretation of deeds. Now, the basic distinction between deeds and documents is that if you 2609, correct. If you look into the definition of document in the Evidence Act, you will find that it not only takes in deed, but also any inscriptions, even if it be on a rock. Even if an inscription on a rock or some other say concrete structure, that will be a document. Whereas in the case of a deed, it is normally a written document. That is the difference between deed and document. Interpretation of deeds beautifully dealt with in this decision, and some basic principles regarding interpretation of a document and appreciation of evidence. You may please this is a classic authority on that. August Construction of Deeds and Statutes. It's an English authority. August Construction of Deeds and Statutes. That is quoted by the Supreme Court in which decision is this one? 2003 Supreme Court 4548. That authority is referred to. The general principles regarding appreciation of documentary evidence is that a document should be understood by reading the document in full. To the extent possible, the golden rule of interpretation is that it should be all the dispositions, all the terms and conditions in the document should be given effect to the. I'll just there are some questions. I'll answer that probably. Some questions are popping up. I'll answer that after this. Document should be read as a whole, and to the extent possible, all the clauses should be given effect to. That is the fundamental rule. Then coming to the other rules, meaning of the document of a particular part of it has to be sought for in the document itself. Suppose the document is given a nomenclature as a sale deed, but on reading the entire clause, you find that's only a gift deed. So the nomenclature may be relevant, but if there is a conflict between the nomenclature and the recitals, certainly the recitals will prevail. Then, of course, you should be aware of one principle in section 91 and 92 Evidence Act. When a document is produced to prove a particular transaction, parties are precluded from adducing oral evidence in varying or altering or modifying the terms in the document. That is covered by 91 and 92. Probably that itself is a large subject or a long subject. Just making a mention of it, there are some decisions also on the point. I'll give you some Supreme Court decisions touching 91, 92. That is very important. When at the time of interpreting a document or appreciating a document, oral evidence is not permissible by virtue of section 91 and 92 of the Evidence Act. Then second rule, first rule is that meaning of the document or a particular part should be understood from the document itself. Then second rule is intention may prevail over the words used. Suppose the words are wrongly used and the intention from the document shows something different, then the intention of the parties will prevail over the words employed. The basic rule of interpretation is that, or appreciation is that, if the document, the terms of the document are very clear, then there is no point in interpreting. You just read it and understand. The question of interpretation will arise only when there is ambiguity in the terms. Otherwise, there is no scope for any interpretation or appreciation. You just read it and understand. And that is the second rule. Then comes third rule. Words are to be taken in their literal meaning, plain meaning, to the extent possible. unless it is technical or legal. Words employed in a deed should be understood while interpreting the document, and it should be appreciated in that way, in plain meaning. Of course, technical and legal meaning should be given the respective meaning because parties must have intended that. Then comes extrinsic evidence admissible. Very rarely, like suppose document is written in a foreign language, then translation is required for understanding, for applying. Then probably you can rely on extrinsic evidence such as a translated version or this. Otherwise, you have to read and understand the document as it stands. Then comes legal terminology or phraseology employed in the document should be understood in the natural common meaning in the prevalent and the legal circles. You can't have a different meaning for that. And the final or rather the foremost thing is that the document should be read as a whole and appreciated. So just to what you call sum up this discussion, the appreciation of evidence in an appeal is exactly the same as in the case of a trial court. The oral evidence should be direct. The added advantage that the trial court had to see the witnesses should be respected. The entire evidence should be taken. You can't take one portion of the evidence and understand it. The entire evidence should be understood in the case of oral evidence. When there is document produced, you have to look into the document to appreciate the contention. And matters covered, terms and conditions covered by a document shall not be allowed to be supplemented or varied or modified by oral evidence. And the oral evidence is permissible against a document only in a situation where the document itself is under challenge. Suppose a gift deed is produced by one party, the other party disputes saying that there is no gift, or a will is produced, the other party says that there is no will. Then you can vary or contradict the terms in the document. Otherwise, when you admit the transaction, there is no challenging terms or varying the terms by virtue of 91 and 92. In a civil case, generally, documentary evidence will prevail over the oral evidence because parties may have a tendency to utter falsehood, but the documents will not say so. So, primacy is always on the documentary evidence. And the rules that I just pointed out certain sections relating to the appreciation of oral and documentary evidence provided under the Evidence Act. So this will apply. So I think I have almost touched all subjects. I'll just wait for the questions because I'll just stop it here.
Yes, sir. So this is by Nitin. I have two questions. Sometimes it is found that certain documents were not known to the plaintiff at the beginning, but at the time of hearing existence of those documents were conveyed to the court. And the however, court did not give time for written arguments, wherein the court did not consider the same in its judgment. Later on, recipe was made to include about the mentioning of said documents, which was denied by the trial court, and review petition, despite being filed, was withdrawn under the fear of heavy cost of imposition by the court. Now, whether those documents still on record and can those be relied upon in an appeal?
No, I think from the question, what I understand is that it could not be produced before original court because at the time that trial happened, it was not within the knowledge of the party. That is what I understand.
Yes, sir.
Okay. In that event, Order 41 Rule 27.
Also, but he says they were not shown in evidence, but he learned when the trial was about to be over.
It came to notice of the party at the end of trial. That is what he says.
In and around the end of the trial.
Okay, then it may be difficult because why? Because 4127 does not permit such a situation. 4127 permits only two situations: when the court improperly declined to produce a document. Two, when the party, despite exercising due diligence, could not find out the existence of such a document. But in this case, probably he was aware of the thing. Then the only possibility is that convince the court by filing an application, convince the appellate court by filing an application that this document is essential for the proper adjudication of the appeal. In that event, probably the appellate court can allow it by exercising the court's power, not on the request of the party. Now, suppose an application is filed calling upon the court to consider the relevance of this document in appeal, and without this document, there cannot be an effective or proper justiciable adjudication, then the appellate court is bound to accept it, going by that this third one in order 21, order 41, rule 27, third category. Now, that is possible. That then it becomes a bounden duty on the appellant to convince the court. Maybe difficult. It's a difficult exercise. I understand that, but then it is possible, theoretically possible. I hope I am clear on that.
Yes, sir. Yes. This is by Sahil Rana. The High Court remanded a first appeal to be decided by the trial court and set aside the judgment. Then the appeal from the judgment of the trial court is a second appeal or a first appeal?
High Court remanded a case to the trial court.
High Court remands the first appeal to be decided by the trial court and set aside the judgment. Then whether the appeal from the judgment of trial court is a second appeal or a first appeal?
It is certainly a first appeal. There can't be a second appeal. Because, see, second appeal arises only when there are two decrees, one by the original court and the other by the first appellate court. So here, once it is remanded, the operative decree has gone. So the second, after remand, the trial court passes an original decree. That can be challenged only in a first appeal. There cannot be a second appeal in such a situation. Second appeal arises only when the appellate court disposes of the matter. Section 100 is very clear on that. There cannot be a doubt. Yes.
So this is by Venkat Srinath. So I have two questions. Plaintiff files a condonation of delay to file an appeal. Can the plaintiff change the lower court pleadings? For example, lower court, plaintiff said mother was mentally unsound and never recovered. In the appeal and condonation of appeal, IA plaintiff changes the grounds and pleads that the mother had filed a police complaint on the respondent twice, which amounts to change of the main suit pleadings.
So I understand. What I understand is that the question is the nature of the suit also assumes importance, because he has not mentioned anything about the nature of the suit. Is it a case that the insanity or sanity of mother was questioned in that case? Is it is mother's mental condition? Is it a question to be decided? Is a facting issue there? I don't understand that, because I don't know why this mother's. Can he speak on this thing? No.
Pardon, sir?
Can he put that question by himself, so that I think this is not very clear. I don't know what exactly is that.
I will just ask. Perchance the man who's managing someone has come. He is just one. Meanwhile, I will read a question.
Okay.
Can the civil suit and appeal? Can the civil suit and appeal be maintainable in a defamation case where employee and co-employee relationship does not?
What is this? What is this question?
So, what is the scope of letters patent appeal in regard to the first appeal? Difference between the two? Is there any statutory right or not?
What is the difference between?
Between this LPA, letters patent appeal, and a first appeal.
No, first appeal is, first appeal is from the original. Letters patent appeal is from the intra-court appeals only. That happens only in the court established under a letter of this charter. No, this first appeal is CPC creation. The other is probably the establishment, the charter of the establishment.
Clause 5.
Is, clause 5, right.
Clause 15. Clause 15.
Right, clause 15, sorry.
Yes. And that too under the, if challenged under Article 226, not but under 227.
Correct. Intra-court, high court appeals.
No, but the law to that effect is that if you file under the under 227, then appeal would not lie. It's
no
a
appeal. Correct.
Then SLP, and if it is under 226, then
there is an appeal against a repetition, but not under a supervisory order under 227.
Yes, sir. So this is on the Facebook. Kumar Madhusa. Lordship, in an original suit for recovery of money, plaintiff bank has miserably failed to prove the statement of accounts under the banker's book of evidence. The defendant, being a social activist, alleges that the suit is a malicious prosecution during the trial. The defendant has proved beyond doubt that the plaintiff has made false claims. Can the defendant pray to the trial court to prosecute plaintiff under the perjury?
No, how can it be? How can it be request the trial court? Because the bank, according to the question, bank failed to prove the statement of account.
Yes, sir.
It doesn't amount to perjury. If it failed, see, suppose there is a falsification in the account, probably that could have raised. If it is actually a mistake, assume it is a mistake on the part of the bank.
No, he says a step further. He says it's a malicious, in fact, a malicious prosecution.
malicious prosecution of the malicious prosecution of a civil case. It is not a malicious prosecution. See, what is generally known to the malicious prosecution is a prosecution in a criminal case. Malicious prosecution of a civil case is also actionable, but your remedy is to file a suit for damages. Or you can claim cost, compensatory cost in the same suit itself. After all, it is only a monetary claim. Yes.
So, Venkat Srinath, mother is the first witness in the gift settlement deed and plaintiff filed a suit to declare registered deed as null and void due to undue influence and coercion by defendant on father. So plaintiff wanted to block mother. I don't know. This is not a question. So first appeal is disposed of on the merits in the absence of respondent. Disposal on merits. Can it be readmitted on the application of the respondent?
Yes, order 41, rule 2021. Yes, disposed on the absence of respondent means ex parte decision. Appellant must have been heard, and the court must have been satisfied that there is merit in his appeal. So without hearing or in the absence of respondent, it must have been decided. In that event, his remedy is to file an application for rehearing and order 41, rule 21.
10 minutes before that. So this is Ramnath. We are unmuting Ramnath. And this is by Manju Anand. While the execution petition is pending, can one file a cross appeal?
While the execution petition is pending.
Can we file a cross appeal?
No, cross appeal has to be filed within 30 days from the date of service of notice in the appeal. If that is within that time, there is no problem. Otherwise, you have to file with a section 5 petition, and the success will depend on the showing costs for the delay.
This is by Anuj Bansal on the Facebook. Suppose excessive court fees is paid in the trial court, then whether the appropriate court fees can be affixed in an appeal which is lesser than what was affixed in the trial court.
Absolutely right, because the liability of a party to pay only the requisite court fee. If excess court fee is paid, at least because this is state enactment in Kerala Court Fees and Suit Valuation Act, if excess court fee is paid, you can claim refund, and you need not pay the excess court appeal, because here the provision, I don't know which act he is referring to. Here, section 52 is the provision for paying court fee in an appeal, first appeal, or in second appeal even. Section 52 says court fee should be paid as in the case of lower court. So, as in the case of lower court means which is the fee actually payable, not the excessive fee. Suppose by inadvertent mistake, excessive fee is paid in the first instance, that may not be repeated in the appeal. Your remedy is to claim the refund in the first court.
So we have unmuted Mr. Ramanath. Yes,
Very good evening, sir.
Good evening, please.
One, I have a doubt, and another is a prayer to you. First, the doubt is that in a suit for declaration and for permanent injunction, consequential relief of permanent injunction, the suit was dismissed. And the first appeal was filed. And in the first appeal, the first appellate court was pleased to decree the suit as far as the declaration prayer is concerned and dismiss the suit appeal for permanent injunction. There, against the decree of declaration, the defendant went in a second appeal before the High Court. And against non-passing of a decree for bare injunction, consequential relief for permanent injunction, the plaintiff himself went in a cross objection in the High Court. What happened there? The cross objectors, the cross appellants, they left the matter in non-prosecution. The cross appeal was dismissed for default. Cross appeal was dismissed for default. Later, the regular appeal was taken. And the regular appeal, the respondents the cross objectors did not appear. While disposing of the regular appeal, the same judge took up the cross appeal, which was already dismissed for default, took up the regular appeal and decreed the suit in entirety in the regular appeal. Whether that is a correct procedure?
In my humble view, it is an incorrect procedure. Because what was the subject matter of second appeal actually? It was only the correctness of granting declaratory relief. Is it not so?
Yes.
Mr. Ramanathan, your good name is Mr. Ramanathan.
But there's some audibility problem at your end.
1 minute. Am I clear now?
Yeah. Now I can hear you.
Okay. Your good name is Mr. Ramanathan.
Yeah, Ramnath.
Okay, Mr. Ramnath, the point is, you said that a declaration and injunction suit was filed. Okay.
Yes.
Section 34 of the Specific Relief Act says, if any consequential relief flows out of the main relief, it should be asked. Otherwise, the suit is not maintainable. That is the
Correct.
basic principle. Right.
Understood.
Then the suit was in proper form at that time. The trial court mistakenly granted declaration, or rather, see, since
Trial court dismissed it in entirety.
okay, trial court dismissed the entire suit. The first appellate court reversed the decree to the extent of declaratory relief alone.
Yes.
That was actually a mistake. That should not have been, because if the
Possession follows title.
if the first appellate court had found that he is entitled to get the substantive relief, there was no reason. There are some decisions which say that once you find that the substantive relief a party is entitled, you can deny the consequential relief.
Yes.
So that was a mistake on the part of the first appellate court. Okay. Then comes the second appeal, challenging the relief of granting declaratory relief. Is it not so? So
Yes.
the defendant has gone in a second appeal, challenging the declaratory
Yes.
part. He was right, because he need only challenge that declaration, because the other is already rejected by the first appellate court.
Yes.
Plaintiff, even if he has not challenged, by virtue of Order 41, Rule 33, probably he may canvass that once the declaration is granted, the court, by invoking its power under Order 41, Rule 33, is saying that it is bound to pass a decree which ought to have been passed, by the court. Here the trial court means the first appellate court, because their powers are coextensive and coterminous.
Yes.
So I think that is, if the High Court finds, or the second appellate court, being the High Court, finds that this is a case where the declaration should be granted, then it can, even without an appeal, grant a relief in favor of the respondent by 4133.
Even when they are dismissed for default. The cross appeal also.
Cross appeal also dismissed for default, because then only the successful party will get the whole package in order. The entire package should be given to him, is it not so?
Yes.
If the court finds that he is entitled to get the substantive part of the suit, then without the ancillary part or the consequential part, it will be a meaningless decree. Then virtually you will be driving him for another suit to file an injunction suit again. So that is a multiplication of litigation, is it not so? Multiplicity of proceedings. That can be avoided. Nothing wrong in that.
So the honorable court is right in reversing its own order of dismissing for default of the cross appeal.
No, the dismissal of this default is only, there is no decision on merit.
Yes.
It is only on the absence of a party it happens.
Yes.
There is, suppose it was disposed on merits, probably then this could not have been done. Since it is only a dismissal for default, there is no adjudication. He is absent, hence dismissed. So when in that situation, look into Order 41, Rule 33, you will find that a proper decree should have been passed. That is the principle in Order 41, Rule 33. Okay. In that view of the matter, probably there is nothing wrong in it.
The second part of my question is my prayer that this is one of the best ever webinars I have ever listened through. Thanks to Mr. Vikas also for organizing. Very exhaustive, but the thing is that we could not follow up all the citations, and we wish to have the citations which you have. Kindly share those things with Mr. Vikas so that everyone can have the fruit of it. Everyone can be fruit of it.
Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Vikas. This is one of the best ever webinars.
Thank you.
We have always been trying to bring the best of the speakers. That's true.
Yes, of course.
And that goes without saying that.
Thank you for that.
And the fact that Justice N. Kumar praising also buttresses our submission that it's one of the best webinars.
Can I
Very exhaustive. Very exhaustive. but the lack of time, the citations are
Correct.
given
No,
less.
see, Mr. Ramna, the problem is because this is a vast subject. If I stick on to some portion, probably I may not be able to cover the entire thing. That is why I was just rushing through that.
So, and that is why Mr. Ramnath is an avid follower of our webinars.
Yes.
Now we in fact started splitting on certain issues, like on MSCT, we have Mr. Srinivas from Madras only. We have asked him to make four parts. We had Justice
one
Ramkumar.
part is over.
Yeah, so now instead of 3, now we have made it 4. We had
Right.
Justice Ramkumar on bails. We got him into 3 parts. Now we have started doing that.
No, because that will be better, because if you take a large subject or rather considerably wide subject, it may be difficult to, because if
Yes, sir, that is what we realized, because webinars of 2 to 3 hours, then people don't stick around. And in the same way, if we split it into 2-3 parts, people, let's assume first part, somebody has missed yours.
correct.
The word of mouth spreads that the first part was very good. They will watch it on the YouTube, and the second part they will
Yes.
join to know that for that insights.
No,
Kindly
that-
do that, sir. Kindly
And
do
I've
that.
also seen that sometimes it so happens that we as a participant enjoy a lot. We are relaxed, but the speaker goes on a fast track only on this ground that he feels the subject is too vast, and it has to be in a compressed form.
No, see, the difficulty is that, Mr. Vikas, the difficulty of compressing a subject is that you have to adhere to the time schedule, and at the same time, you have to see that the major topics are touched in the meantime. That is the
Yes.
difficult part of it.
So off late, this is what is called, that is what says practice makes a man perfect. Though we are not got perfect.
Experience
But-
makes a man expert.
Yeah, but with the flux of time, we have started developing that some speaker is good and he feels that it cannot be covered in 50 minutes or 1 hour. Then we ask him, sir, like with Mr. Srinivas, we have said, all Tuesdays we will have. So one Tuesday gone, next Tuesday another topic, then another Tuesday, then another Tuesday. So that he also doesn't rushes it, and we also get the deeper insights.
Right, very
We
good.
can
This is
have
our
more
knowledge
number of
area.
citations. We can have more number of citations also.
Correct. And I'll share the citations with Mr. Vikas so that it will be useful for you.
Yes, sir.
Where,
Yes.
where are you practicing, Mr. Amna?
I am practicing Chennai, sir.
Chennai. Okay, good.
So we are just unmuting for the last question. This is by Sachinanand. So whether section 96 subclause 3 of CPC is in conflict with order 43 rule 1A.
1 minute. Sachidananda Pai.
So this is Sachinanand. He says whether section 96 subclause 3 of CPC is in conflict with order 43 rule 1.
1 minute. Let me just take that order 43. Order 43, which provision he mentions? Order 43, rule 1.
It is order 43 rule 1A.
1A
Capital A.
is no, 1A. Okay. Right to challenge non-appealable orders in appeal against decrees. Where any order is made under this code against a party, thereupon any judgment is pronounced. Where any order is made under this code against a party, and thereupon any judgment is pronounced against such party, is drawn up. Such party may appeal against the decree, that such order should not have been made, and the judgment should not have been pronounced. In an appeal against a decree passed in a suit after or refusing to record a compromise, it shall be open to the appellant to contest the decree on the ground that the compromise should or should not have been recorded. Maybe he may be referring to order 43 rule 1 capital A sub rule 2. He may be referring to that.
96.3, he says the conflict is, he says 96.3 provides that no appeal shall lie from a decree passed by the court with the consent of parties. And then he says order 43 rule 3.
1 minute. Before that, let me just take section 105.
It says where any order is made against this. No, order 43 1A2 probably sees in an appeal against a decree passed in a suit after recording a compromise or refusing to record a compromise, it shall be open to the appellant to contest the decree on the ground that the compromise should or should not have been recorded.
I understand this question, but on a plain reading, in an appeal against a decree passed in a suit after recording a compromise or refusing to record a compromise, it shall be open to the appellant.
So rather, I will say that it will also be in consonance, just like a mediation, where the compromise is arrived at in terms of Section 89.
Section 89, Section 89.
So Section 89 is a referral part, but ultimately it's a compromise.
Any decree passed in a referred matter under Section 89, there is a deemed finality for that. So, because Section 89 in the case of a mediation or in the case of a Lok Adalat can only be passed on consent. Without consent, there cannot be imposition.
Then they have a decree drawn accordingly.
Correct. Consent is the basic, the quintessence of the decree. Is it not so? The soul of the decree is consent. If that consent is disputed, in one decision, Supreme Court says that I have given the citation, a year 2005 Supreme Court 3799. Justice R.C. Lahoti, Justice C.K. Thakkar, and Justice Balasubramanian, 3 judges. Kishan alias Ramkishan versus Behari. A year 2005 Supreme Court 3799. The Supreme Court says Section 96(3), Order 23, Rule 3 proviso, and Order 43, Rule 1 clause M are relevant provisions. When there is a dispute whether there is a compromise or not, the decree accepting the compromise on resolution of that controversy could not be said to be a decree passed with the consent of the parties. Hence, the bar under 96(3) could not have application. So, an appeal is maintainable. That is what the 3-judge bench says. It may be, but I think they have not considered this Order 43, Rule 1, capital A2. They have not considered, subject to correction. I'll have to look into that again, once again. I can give you a direct answer right now, because there is one decision by Supreme Court by the 3-judge bench. Maybe that, I don't know whether in that decision.
That's not audible. That's not audible. Your speaker.
1 minute. Have you heard the 2005 Supreme Court 3799? Have you heard that citation? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Have you heard that citation?
Right, sir. We will share it on the platform.
Okay, I'll share it on the platform. I have already given that citation to you. 2005 Supreme Court 3799.
So I will share it in the group after taking the citation from you. So I think it's raining quite heavily out there.
Correct. It's raining.
I suppose the rain has, the torrential speed has increased more because the audibility has slightly become more lesser now.
Right.
So, be that as it may, sir, it was as what Ramanath says, I can just buttress that again submission that it was a session which has been quite engaging, as well as the volume of judgments which you have shared with us, along with the deeper insights of the topic, which at the first blush we said that one should always learn these nitty-gritties. We've actually enriched and engaged ourselves in a webinar, that too on a weekend, and we have actually enjoyed that session. And tomorrow, in our pursuit to have a webinar on the knowledge from speakers, we have amongst us Professor Dr. B.T. Kaul, who is a former chairman of the Delhi Judicial Academy and also a professor of the Delhi University. He will be speaking on the nitty-gritties of group liabilities under Section 34 and 149 of IPC. So do stay connected with us tomorrow at 5 p.m. Since on weekends we have it on 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. in terms of the convenience of the speakers. And thank you, sir, for sharing your insights, and that too on when there are torrential rains and still keeping up with the tunes with the time and sharing your knowledge. We are all obliged. All those who are watching us on the Facebook as well as on this platform, we are actually indebted the way you have showered your insights in a short span of time. And as we were sharing, the topic is such huge that sometimes it's very difficult to squeeze in a short time. But still, you managed it, and we have all learned in whatever manner. And Ramanath says it's all thumbs up. And thank you, sir. Everyone, stay safe, stay blessed. Namaskar.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Also, it's the other way around. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.